The sun never rose over Brimstone Draw. It simply bled. A slow, septic seep of rust-colored light leaked over the eastern ridges, staining the alkali flats a diseased copper. The light found no purchase on anything soft. It illuminated the land's skeleton barbed wire, strung tight enough to sing a high, mournful note when the wind pushed through it. Skeletal ribs of yucca pointing their Spanish bayonets at the sky, and the flat, unforgiving gray of the packed earth around the Pike homestead. The wind was the only thing that moved with purpose. It was a cold wind for this time of year, carrying the grit of 1,000 miles, and it scrubbed the landscape raw. It pulled at the shingles of the small, defiant ranch house and moaned under the eaves of the barn, a low, grieving sound that never ceased. This was a land that held its breath, waiting for the next misfortune. Out of the gray-washed shadow of the house came Rowan Pike. He moved like a man who paid for every gesture in sweat and tissue. He was just north of 30, but the high-altitude sun and the constant scarcity had carved him into something older. He was tall, pared down to knotted muscle and bone, with a leanness that bordered on starvation, though it was merely efficiency. His movements were saved. He didn't turn his head if a glance would do. He didn't take 2 steps if one long stride could cover the ground. His boots, worn slick on the soles, made almost no sound on the hardpan. He paused by the water trough, his shadow stretching long and thin in the encroaching dawn. He dipped a finger in the water. Ice slicked the edges. He breathed out. A small plume of white vapor instantly snatched away by the wind. He was checking his lines. The stable, the tack room, the small corral. It was a ritual. This was not a place where a man could afford surprises. Surprises, out here, meant death. They meant finding a fence down and your meager herd scattered to the canyons, or a cougar track near the chicken coop, or the hollow silence of an empty stable. He'd spent the last 2 years alone, since his younger brother, Silas, had taken a fever that burned him out in 3 days. The loneliness had settled on Rowan not like a blanket, but like a second, tighter skin. It was just him and the land was a merciless partner. He was headed for the stable, his mind already calculating the hours needed to track the 3 steers that had broken the lineup near Devil's Jaw. He needed to be moving before the sun was fully up. He heard it. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the wire. Clang, skr! Rowan Pike froze. He didn't tense, he simply ceased all motion, becoming another shadow against the barnwood. It was the sound of the galvanized water bucket by the stable door. His bucket. It had been struck, and it had scraped the ground. An empty sound. He stood, listening, letting the wind cover the silence. His eyes scanned the deep shadows pooled near the hayrick. 50 yards away. Nothing. He listened past the wind's cry. There. A soft thump. Not a boot. It was the sound of an unshod hoof, or one wrapped in burlap, placed deliberately on the earth. A nervous step. It came again, closer to the stable door. Someone was in his stable. Someone was trying to be quiet. Rowan's right hand drifted, slow as smoke, toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip, but he stopped. A gunshot was an alarm. An alarm meant escalation, and he was one man. He let his hand drop. His eyes, the color of wet slate, narrowed. He slid his weight, shifting his balance to the balls of his feet, and took one silent step toward the corner of the stable, keeping the building between him and the sound. He heard a muffled snort. A horse, his horse. Then, a whisper, a desperate, sharp sound, like someone trying to soothe an animal while choking back their own fear. Easy, easy now. Rowan moved. He didn't run. He rounded the corner in 3 long, economical strides, just as the stable door swung wide. The shadow didn't bolt toward the open range. It burst from the darkness and made straight for the corral gate, where his best horse was tied. It was a girl. She was barely more than a wisp, maybe 19, maybe 20, but worn hard. Her skin was dark, kissed by a sun he didn't recognize. Her hair was a mess of thick, black braids, tangled with burrs and bits of straw. She wore clothes that were barely clothes at all, a man's torn linen shirt, gray with dirt, and trousers that were ripped and flapping around her ankles. She was barefoot. She moved with a frantic, desperate agility. She didn't climb the corral fence. She vaulted it. She was making for Ghost Lantern. His heart clenched. Not the cattle, not the tack, the horse. Ghost Lantern was a pale silver stallion, almost white, a streak of moonlight in the rusty dawn. He was fast, bred from Spanish stock, and the only beautiful thing Rowan Pike owned. The horse whinnied, stamping nervously as the girl scrambled onto the fence rail, gathered the reins Rowan had left looped there, and threw herself onto its back. She had no saddle. She just landed, gripping the horse's mane with one hand, kicking her bare heels into its flanks. Ha! The reins snapped taut. Sand and gravel exploded from under the stallion's hooves, stinging the air like sparks. Ghost Lantern pivoted on its powerful haunches, nostrils flaring, ready to tear a hole in the wind and vanish into the draw. The girl was already leaning low over his neck, a fleeting silhouette of desperation. Rowan Pike had no time to think. He only had time to act. His body knew this movement better than it knew prayer. His left hand shot out and snatched the coiled lariat that hung from its peg on the main gate post. It was his working rope, stiff with alkali and sweat. In one fluid, unbroken motion, he stepped forward, shaking out a loop. His wrist snapped. A practiced, economical rotation. There was no grand swing, no showman's flourish, just the physics of necessity. The rope sang. It hissed through the cold morning air, a perfect, pale crescent moon against the gray sky. It uncoiled with lethal accuracy. It wasn't aimed for her. He didn't rope people. The loop sailed over the horse's turning head and snapped tight, clean around the saddle horn of the saddle he had placed there not 10 minutes prior, ready for his own ride. Thwack! The rope cinched. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. Ghost Lantern hit the end of the 20 feet of slack and was jerked to a violent halt, his head thrown back, a strangled scream tearing from his throat. The girl, unprepared for the sudden stop, was catapulted forward. She lost her grip on the mane and pitched over the horse's neck. She cried out a sharp, bitten-off sound of pure terror. She clung to the saddle horn with both hands, her body hanging sideways, her bare feet scrambling for purchase against the horse's shoulder. But she held on, clove hitch stubborn. The horse reared, fighting the rope. But Rowan dug his heels into the dirt, leaning back, his weight a perfect anchor. He held the rope fast, the hemp burning against his glove. "Whoa," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Whoa, boy." The horse, recognizing the voice, quieted, shuddering, his flanks dark with sweat. The girl was still hanging on, panting, her face buried in the horse's mane. Rowan Pike didn't pull the rope tighter. He didn't drag her down. He walked, hand over hand, shortening the distance, his boots crunching on the gravel. Each step was deliberate. He stopped when his shoulder was flush with the horse's head. The girl was breathing in ragged, painful gasps. She was covered in a fine sheen of sweat that was already turning to ice in the wind. She refused to look at him. Rowan reached up, his large, calloused hand bypassing her completely. He gripped the leather pommel of the saddle, his knuckles brushing her frantic grip. He didn't pull her. He just held the saddle, anchoring her, anchoring his horse. She finally lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, black, and filled with a terror so profound it looked like madness. But as her gaze locked onto his, the terror receded, burned away by something else, a hard, defiant, bottom-of-the-well stubbornness. She was cornered. She was caught, and she was done running. Rowan Pike looked at her. He saw the torn shirt, the raw scrape on her cheek where a branch had whipped her. He smelled the smoke that clung to her clothes, not campfire smoke, but the acrid smell of a structure fire, of burned pine and ruin. His own face was impossible to read, a mask of sun-cured leather and shadow. His slate-gray eyes were cold, assessing the situation. The stolen horse, the desperate girl. He leaned in, just an inch, close enough that she would feel the words rather than just hear them. His voice was like gravel washing in a dry creek. "That all you want?" he said, the words cutting through the wind. "Or just—" He left the question hanging in the air, sharp as a blade. She just panted, her chest heaving. She didn't answer. Her eyes held his, a silent, ferocious declaration of war. And then something changed. It wasn't him. It wasn't her. It was the horizon. Her gaze broke from his, flicking instinctively past his shoulder, toward the long, empty road that led to Brimstone Draw. Rowan didn't need to turn. He'd lived his entire life reading the sky. Far off, maybe 2 miles, a smear of gray dust was rising against the rust-colored dawn. It wasn't the lazy drift of a lone rider. It was a plume, a fast-moving, deliberate cloud kicked up by at least 3, maybe 4 horses, riding hard. It was the signature of a pursuit. The girl's body went rigid, the defiance in her eyes fractured, and for a split second, the raw, animal panic returned. She looked back at him, and in that look, he saw the answer to his unfinished question. She didn't just want his horse, she wanted escape. Rowan Pike's mind, which had been fixed on the immediate problem of theft and his lost morning, recalibrated. He thought of the steers he was supposed to be chasing, the day's work lost. He thought of the trouble this girl, this barefoot wraith, was dragging behind her. His survival instinct, honed sharp by years of solitude, screamed at him. This was not his fight. This was not his trouble. But the trouble was already here. It was standing in his yard, breathing his air, its hands clinging to his saddle. The dust cloud was coming for her, which meant it was coming for him. He looked at the girl. He saw the way she bit her lip, the way her knuckles were white on his saddle. She was preparing to be pulled down. She was preparing for the rope to tighten, for the blow to fall. Rowan Pike made a choice. His hand, the one holding the lariat, still wrapped tight around the saddle horn, moved. He didn't tighten it. He didn't secure the knot. He let it go slack. Just an inch of rope, fed back through his glove. It was a gesture so unexpected, so contrary to the laws of capture, that it threw the girl completely off balance. She had been bracing against the pull, and the sudden absence of it made her falter. She swayed, her eyes wide, staring at him. The slack rope hung in the air between them, a new, more dangerous question. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, the sound of the approaching hoofbeats grew louder, carried on the restless, moaning wind. The slack in the rope was a statement. It hung between them, a broken promise of violence. The girl Tamsin, she would soon call herself, remained frozen, her mind unable to bridge the gap between the man who had just roped her horse and the man who was now, inexplicably, letting that rope fall loose. Rowan Pike's eyes were on the horizon. The dust cloud was a dirty thumbprint smudging the clean, cold sky. It was closer now, close enough to be a threat within minutes, not hours. He took 2 slow steps back, pulling Ghost Lantern with him. The horse, still trembling, obeyed the familiar hand, moving away from the gate and deeper into the relative shadow of the stable wall. Tamsin, still clinging to the saddle, had no choice but to move with the animal. Her bare feet touched the ground as she slid down, landing badly on an ankle that twisted beneath her. She stifled a cry, biting down hard on her lower lip, her face pale. She stood, favoring the one foot, her hands still clutching the saddle horn as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. She was trapped between the man she had tried to rob and the dust cloud that was coming to claim her. Rowan turned his full attention back to her. The approaching riders were a fact. She was the variable. He needed to know what kind of trouble she was. His left hand, the gloved one, still held the lariat, its loop now uselessly pooled on the ground. He let the rope drop completely. Then He raised his right hand. Slowly, he uncurled his fingers, showing her his palm. It was a gesture one used with a spooked mare, a gesture that said, "I have no weapon, I mean you no harm." But his eyes said something else. They said, "Explain. Name." His voice was quiet, but it had the texture of the land itself. It wasn't a question so much as a demand for a single, solid fact in a morning that had become dangerously unstable. The girl's chest was still heaving, her breaths shallow and fast. She stared at his open, empty hand. She looked from the hand to his face, searching those cold, slate-gray eyes for a trick. She found none, only a profound, weary patience. She swallowed, the sound clicking in the silence. Her voice, when it came, was a surprise. It was low and rough as broken shale, as if she hadn't used it for days, or had used it only for screaming. Tamsin Redbird. She spoke the two words slowly, deliberately. Each one was a stone placed carefully on a ledge. It wasn't an answer given. It was a position declared. She did not look away. The fear that had been in her eyes was still there, but it was now banked, like coals under a layer of hard, defiant ash. Rowan Pike held her gaze. Tamsin Redbird. The name meant nothing to him, but the woman saying it meant something. His eyes, trained by a life of observation, reading the sky for rain, the ground for tracks, the twitch of a steer's ear for sickness, began to take her apart. He wasn't looking at her as a woman. He was assessing her as a problem. The shirt, he saw now, was not just torn. The collar was stiff, dark with a stain that wasn't mud. The smell of smoke he'd caught earlier was stronger now. It was the sour, chemical smell of a house fire, of possessions burned, not just a campfire. He looked at her hands, still clutching the saddle. Her knuckles were raw, scraped clean of skin, but it was her wrist that held his attention. Peeking from the frayed cuff of the oversized shirt, he saw the mark, a dark, angry welt, perfectly circular. A rope burn, but not from a lariat. It was the chafe of a rope that had been tied tight, and tied for a long time. His gaze traveled down. She was favoring her left leg. The ankle was visibly swollen, puffed up and purple over the bone. It was a sprain, and a bad one. He looked at her bare feet, caked in mud and scratched, the soles raw. She had come a long way, and she had come hard. Then he saw the gun. It was tucked into the waistband of her trousers, almost hidden by the fold of the baggy shirt. It wasn't a new gun. It was an old Navy model, the metal pitted, the wooden grip worn smooth. But what caught his eye was a mark carved into that grip. It was a crude, angry-looking symbol, etched with the point of a knife, a thin, stick-figure coyote, its leg caught in the jagged teeth of a trap. He stared at the carving. It was a brand, a sign, and it was ugly. Tamsin saw where his gaze had settled. Her entire body went rigid. The breath she had been taking hitched in her chest. Her hand, the one that wasn't scraped raw, moved protectively toward the gun. Her fingers splayed. Her voice was a low, desperate hiss. "Not mine." Rowan said nothing. He just looked from the gun back to her face. His silence was a heavier accusation than any word. "Siarclack." The sound was unmistakable. It was metallic, sharp, and it cut through the morning wind. It was the sound of a rifle's hammer being pulled back to full cock. It came from the ridge of prickly pear and cholla cactus that marked the northern edge of his property, about 70 yards out. Rowan Pike didn't jump. He didn't spin. His head tilted, just a fraction, like an animal pinpointing a sound. He had been so focused on the girl, on the immediate threat, that he hadn't heard the stalking threat. The dust cloud had been a diversion. The real hunters were already here. They had flanked them. Tamsin's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wide with a fresh, surging terror. She made an involuntary move. A half-step back into the open. Rowan moved. His reaction, pure instinct. He didn't reach for her. He didn't grab her. He used his shoulder. He stepped into her. A solid, unyielding impact that knocked her off balance and sent her staggering backward, forcing her out of the open and into the deeper shadow cast by the low-hanging eaves of the tack shed. "Hey," she gasped, hitting the wall hard. Pwing! A puff of white-gray dust exploded from the exact spot where her chest had been a second before. The sound of the rifle shot, a flat crack, echoed half a second later, rolling across the draw. Tamsin stared at the bullet hole in the dirt. A perfect, neat little crater. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. She was breathing in short, sharp huffs, like a winded horse. Pwing! A second shot, this one high, splintering the top rail of the corral fence. It wasn't a killing shot. It was a warning. It was a statement. "We see you. You are pinned." Tamsin flinched at the second impact. A full-body shudder, but she did not scream. Her back was pressed flat against the rough wood of the shed, her hands splayed, as if trying to push herself through the wall. Rowan was already at the shed door. It was a heavy, sliding door, and he pulled it back just enough for a person to slip through. The darkness inside was thick, smelling of leather, axle grease, and dry hay. He looked at her. The dust from the riders was settling. They weren't charging. They were content to wait. They had them boxed in. Inside. He said it wasn't a request. Tamsin's eyes darted from his face to the black, unknown square of the doorway, then back to the cactus ridge, where a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel had just vanished. This man had roped her. This man had a face carved from stone. He was a stranger. But the men on the ridge had just tried to put a bullet through her. The hard, defiant line of her mouth softened. The ash of her resistance crumbled, revealing the raw, exhausted terror beneath. It wasn't trust. He could see that clearly. It was the simple, desperate mathematics of survival. It was the calculation of a creature that had run out of open ground, choosing the lesser of two dangers. She pushed off the wall, stumbled on her bad ankle, and lunged past him into the darkness of the shed. Rowan Pike followed, sliding the heavy door shut. Thud! The world vanished. The sudden plunge from the rusty dawn into the absolute black of the windowless shed was total. Light and sound were cut off, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the world reformed, built from other senses. The smell of old leather was overpowering. The air was cold, still, and dry, and loud. In the suffocating silence, the sound of their bodies was amplified to a roar. He could hear the rasp of his own breathing. He could hear the frantic, wet sound of Tamsin's. But beneath that, another sound, a matched set. Thump, 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 thump. Two heartbeats, out of sync, filling the small space. One, his own, steady, a heavy, measured beat. The other was a frantic, panicked hammering, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. Rowan stood with his back to the door, letting his eyes adjust. He could just make out her shape, a slightly darker mass against the shadows. She was pressed into the far corner, as far from him as she could get, next to a stack of empty grain sacks. He could hear her trying to control her breathing, trying to force the panic down. She was listening, listening for him to move, listening for the men outside. The tension in the tiny space was a physical thing. It was a wire drawn taut between them, vibrating with her fear and his suspicion. He had just saved her life, and now he was trapped with her. He had invited the trouble in, and now it was sitting in his shed, holding a gun with an ugly brand. A sliver of light from a crack in the roof high above cut through the darkness, illuminating a single, dusty beam. It was just enough to see her face. She was watching him. Her eyes were huge in the gloom, all pupil. He saw a piece of straw, yellow and bright, clinging to the dark, damp fabric of her shirt, just below her collarbone. It must have come from the hayrick when she was hiding, waiting to steal his horse. It was out of place. It was a small, domestic detail on a canvas of raw violence. Without thinking, driven by an old, ingrained instinct for order, for fixing things that were wrong, a loose hinge, a broken rein, a piece of straw, he reached out. His movement was slow, telegraphed, but it was still a movement toward her in the dark. Tamsin reacted instantly. She flinched, sucking in a sharp, terrified breath, and pressed herself harder into the corner, her hand flying to the gun at her waist. Her whole body became a knot of pure, defensive tension. Rowan stopped, his hand froze in midair, fingers slightly extended. He held the position for a beat, 2 beats. He didn't pull his hand back. He just held it there, in the space between them, letting her see it, letting her terror peak and then recede. "Straw," he said. His voice was too loud in the small space. He said it again, softer, barely a whisper. "You have a straw." He moved his fingers, slowly, toward the spot on her collar. Tamsin watched his hand, her gaze flicking from his fingers to his eyes and back again. She was trembling. He could see the fine tremor in her shoulders. She was a coiled spring, and his touch might be the thing that made her snap. He touched it. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed the fabric of her shirt, then closed on the single, tiny piece of straw. The moment his skin touched her, Tamsin's entire body seized. She went absolutely rigid, her breath catching in her throat. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin, the frantic pulse in her neck just inches from his hand. He plucked the straw away. He held it up for a second in the thin beam of light, then let it fall to the floor. He pulled his hand back, slowly, and let it drop to his side. Tamsin Redbird did not move. She stayed pressed against the wall, her hand still on her gun, but the tension in her shoulders eased. Just a fraction. The rigid, defiant line of her jaw softened, and she let out the breath she had been holding in a long, shuddering sigh that was almost a sob. It was the first human sound she had made. It was the sound of a body that had been pushed past its limit, finding one. Small, incomprehensible moment of safety. Outside, the wind howled, scraping sand against the wooden door. There was no shouting, no more gunfire. Rowan moved to the door and pressed his ear against a crack in the wood. He listened. The hoofbeats were gone. The glint of the rifle was gone. The dust cloud that had been their herald had vanished, dissolving back into the plains. The men hadn't left. He knew that. This wasn't a charge. It was a siege. They had pulled back to the Cholla Ridge, or maybe to the dry creek bed. They were patient. They were watching. The trouble hadn't gone away. It was just waiting for the dark. He turned, his back to the door, and looked at the girl huddling in the corner. She had stopped shaking. She was just watching him, her face a mask of exhaustion and suspicion. The quiet in the shed was no longer empty. It was filled with unanswered questions. The silence in the tack shed was louder than the gunshots had been. It was a thick, pressurized quiet, filled with the sound of 2 people breathing in the dark. Tamsin Redbird was a dark shape in the corner, her hand still resting on the butt of the old pistol. Rowan Pike stood by the door, listening. He listened for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. The wind scrubbed the outside of the building, a high, lonely sound. There were no voices, no metallic clicks, no hoofbeats. The men out there were patient. They knew the rancher was here, and now they knew he had the girl. They had seen her run. They had seen him shield her. They had the only water source for miles. This was a siege, and they had all the time in the world. But Rowan couldn't wait. A man blind is a man dead. He needed to know his enemy. He slid his eye to a crack in the door planking. The sun was higher now, a harsh, clarifying white. The yard was empty. The Cholla Ridge was just a ridge, shimmering in the heat. They were hidden. He looked at Tamsin. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound." She just stared at him, her eyes black holes in the gloom. She didn't nod. She didn't have to. She was a creature gone to ground. Rowan slid the door open just a crack, an inch of blinding light. He slipped through it like a shadow, low and fast, and was behind the water trough in a second. He paused, scanning the ridge. Nothing. He moved again. A swift, economic dash to the corner of the stable, then along its wall, using the building as a block. He made his way back to the corral, to the place where the confrontation had happened. He dropped to one knee, his eyes on the ground. Not the horizon. He was a man who read the earth. The tracks told the story. Tamsin's bare feet, the deep, frantic divots where she had landed after her jump, the scuff where her ankle had turned. His own boot prints, deep and solid. And the others? He circled the house, moving toward the patch of prickly pear where the shots had come from. He found the tracks easily. At least 3 horses. Not mustangs. They were shod. The shoes were heavy, uniform, with a distinct cleat on the heel. It was a military style, or one meant to mimic it. These weren't panicked posse members. They were organized. They had ridden in quiet, dismounted, and set up an ambush. He found where the rifleman had been lying, a small depression in the dust, 2 brass cartridges, still gleaming. He left them. He scouted the area, his gaze sweeping the ground, looking for anything else they might have left. He found it in a cleft of rock, tucked away as if to keep the wind from it. It was a piece of paper, folded twice. It was stiff, and the bottom corner was stained with a dark, rusty smear that was definitely not mud. His fingers, thick and calloused, felt the stain. It was dry, but not old. Maybe a day. He unfolded the paper. It was a scrap, torn from a larger sheet. A notice. The printing was crude, the lettering thick. Wanted. Most of the description was gone, torn away. But at the bottom, the 2 crucial lines remained, written in a heavy, brutal script. For the murder of, Tamsin Redbird. And beneath that, the reason for the professional patients, the military shoes, and the rifle shots. Reward $60. Dead or alive. He stared at the words. $60. It was enough to buy a man's life. Or, in this case, a girl's. He folded the scrap and slid it into his shirt pocket. He made his way back to the tack shed. The same way he had come, shadow to shadow. He slipped inside, sliding the door shut, plunging them back into the thick, leathery darkness. Tamsin hadn't moved. She was a statue of terror. "They're settled in," he said, his voice low. He let his eyes adjust, waiting for us to move. He crossed the small space and stood in front of her. She tensed, her hand twitching toward her pistol. He didn't say anything. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded, blood-stained paper, and held it out to her. She didn't take it. She just stared at it. In the single beam of dusty light from the roof, she could read her own name. She saw the dark stain on the corner. Her jaw tightened so hard he could see the muscles bunch under her skin. The fear in her eyes was momentarily burned away by a flare of pure, white-hot indignation. "I didn't kill anyone," she hissed. The words were sharp, cracked, and absolute. Rowan Pike didn't care about the denial. He cared about the facts. He looked at the paper, then back at her. His voice was flat, empty of judgment, a tool for digging. "Who's dead?" Tamsin's face crumpled. It was a painful thing to watch. The hard, defiant mask broke, and for a second, the raw, profound grief of her situation washed over her. She looked away, staring at the grain sacks in the corner. "Sutter Hale," she said, her voice dropping to a rough whisper. He was a deputy in Farrier's Gap." Rowan waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. "But he didn't die," she said, her voice shaking. "He's the one." She stopped. She took a deep, shuddering breath and forced the words out. "It was his wife, Amelia. He killed her. He hurt her. And then he killed her. He was drunk. He said she was as I seeing another man. Her head came up, and her eyes, when they met his, were burning. They were red-rimmed, dry and hot. There were no tears, just a terrible, arid anger. He was going to blame it on the natives. He set the house on fire to cover it. He was going to say they came in, took her, and burned the place. She pointed, her finger trembling, at her own chest. And he was going to blame me, said I helped them, said I was the one who let them in. I saw it, she whispered, the words barely audible. I was in the pantry. I saw him with her. I saw him light the match. I just ran. I ran until my feet were bloody. I ran until I found your stable. Rowan Pike processed the information. A corrupt deputy, a murdered wife, a fire, a scapegoat, and now a $60 bounty to silence the only witness. His gaze dropped to the old Navy pistol at her waist, to the crude carving on the grip, the coyote with its leg in a trap. The gun, he said, the brand. Tamsin looked down, her hand covering the symbol as if to hide it. His Hales, I grabbed it when I ran. I just grabbed it. She shook her head. But the mark, that's them. Them. The men out there, she said, her voice thick with a new kind of dread. The snare men, that's their mark. They aren't law, they're bounty hunters, but they're just scavengers. They work for anyone who pays, in cash or whiskey. They wear old, rusty tin hats, like miners. They're Hale's men. He's paying them that $60 to bring me back, or just to stop me. Rowan finally understood. This wasn't a posse that would give up. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a disposal. The snare men were here to erase a problem, and he had just painted himself as part of it. He turned away from her, his mind calculating, the pieces of the problem clicking into place. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't fight them. There were at least 3, probably more, and they held the high ground. His only advantage was the land. He knew it. They didn't. We wait for dark, he said, his voice decisive. He was no longer questioning. He was planning. Full dark. Moon's not up for another few hours after sundown. We can't go north. They're watching the ridge. We go west. He pointed to the far wall of the shed, as if he could see through it. The Ghostwater Arroyo. It's dry this time of year. It cuts deep. We take the horses down into the creek bed. It'll give us cover for 5 miles, all the way to the Sierra del Cobre. They won't follow us into that blackness. Not at night. He began to move, his purpose clear. He was no longer a man reacting. He was a man preparing for war. He went to a dusty chest in the corner, unlocked it, and pulled out a leather satchel. He began filling it, his movements quick and sure in the dim light. He took a small tin of salve, a roll of clean bandages. He grabbed his spare canteen from a peg. He checked his rifle, sliding the action, checking the load. We'll need food, water. It's a 2-day ride to get clear of this territory. Tamsin watched him, her breathing still uneven, but the panic was gone, replaced by a stunned, fragile disbelief. He was gathering supplies. We'll need food. We take the horses. She pushed herself off the wall, wincing as her full weight landed on her bad ankle. My horse. She's in the stable, he said, not looking up. The roan. She's tired, but she'll run. Ghost Lantern is faster. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and grabbed his rifle. He opened the door a crack. The yard was still empty. The stable, now! Move fast! Keep low! He slid out. Tamsin followed, limping heavily, her hand on her gun. They crossed the 10 yards of open, sun-scorched ground in a frantic, stumbling dash. Rowan pulled the stable door open, shoved her inside, and followed, barring it behind them. The stable was warmer, smelling of hay and horse. Ghost Lantern whinnied from his stall, his silver coat almost glowing in the gloom. The little roan mare Tamsin had tried to steal was in the next stall, head down, exhausted. Tamsin moved toward the stallion. She stopped at the stall door, her hand outstretched. "Ghost lantern," she said softly, reading the small, painted nameplate on the wood. The horse, sensing her fear, her exhaustion, nudged her palm with his soft nose, snorting gently. Tamsin leaned her forehead against the horse's head, her eyes closing, her whole body slumping in a wave of relief. She stroked his muzzle, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. It was the first moment of peace he had seen from her. She turned, her back to the horse, and looked at Rowan. He was tightening the cinch on his own saddle, his movements efficient, practiced. Why? The question was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. He stopped, his hand on the saddle leather. "Why what?" "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was raw. "You don't know me. I tried to steal your horse. Those men, the snare men, they'll burn this place to the ground to get me. Why?" Rowan Pike stood straight. He looked at her, his face a mask of old sun and new shadows. He didn't have a long speech. He didn't have words for ideals. He had only a single, scarred fact. "Because someone left me behind once," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. As he said them, his gaze drifted past her, to a hook by the grain bin. It was covered in old, cracked bridles and lengths of rope, but hanging among them, a small splash of color, a faded, dark blue woolen scarf. The memory hit him, as it always did, not as a thought, but as a physical blow. The sting of cold wind, the smell of powder, the high, desperate cry of his brother. Silas. He remembered another group of riders, cut from the same cloth as the snare men, and his own fatal hesitation. A 1-second delay that had cost him everything. He had been left behind, but the truth, the one that ate at him in the dark, was that he had been the one who had failed to act. He had been the one who had frozen. He would not freeze again. He turned back to his work, his movements jerky, the memory still clinging to him. The stable was too bright, the memories too clear. He saw the lantern hanging by the door, its flame burning low, casting a weak, yellow circle. He walked over to it. He checked the canteens Tamsin had found, saw they were full. He looked at the girl, who was now quietly braiding a piece of ghost lantern's mane, her hands finding a small, steady rhythm. He reached up and turned the small metal key on the lantern. The flame sputtered, shrank, and died, plunging the stable into a deep, comforting blackness. He leaned his back against the rough wood of the door, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "Now we wait," he said, his voice a disembodied rumble in the dark. "We wait until the dark is deep enough to move." Hours had passed. The thin gray light of dawn had hardened into the white, indifferent glare of midday. And now, finally, that glare was softening. Dusk was falling, and with it, a drop in the wind. The silence outside the ranch house was no longer a pause. It was a presence, a heavy, watchful, patient presence. They had moved from the stable to the house during the brightest, hottest part of the day. A single, scurrying dash across the yard that had drawn no fire. The snare men were content to wait. Now, in the small, clean kitchen, a single kerosene lamp threw a weak yellow circle of light. Rowan had built a small, low fire in the cast-iron stove, not for warmth, but to cook. The only sound in the house was the soft, rhythmic plup, plup, plup of thick bean stew bubbling in a heavy pot. Tamsin Redbird sat in the corner farthest from the single window. She hadn't taken the chair Rowan had offered. Instead, she sat on the floor, her back pressed hard against the wall, her knees drawn up. She had pulled a straight-backed wooden chair in front of her, not to sit on, but as a barrier, a flimsy, three-legged fence against the world. She was a feral thing brought inside, and she hadn't yet decided if the shelter was a kindness or just a different kind of trap. Rowan ignored her, his movements economical as always. He had gone to his medicine chest, a small wooden box marked with a faded red cross. He took out a roll of clean white bandages and a small tin of salve that smelled sharply of pine tar and turpentine. He walked over to her. He didn't loom, but his presence was solid, blocking the light from the stove. "Your wrist," he said. Tamsin flinched, her hand instinctively moving to the pistol at her waist. "The rope burn," he clarified, his voice flat. He crouched, not too close, and set the tin and the bandages on the floor between them. "It'll foul if you don't clean it." She stared at the items, then at his face. His expression was unreadable. It was the face of a man checking a fence line. No more, no less. Slowly, as if it were a wounded animal, she extended her right arm. He leaned forward, taking her wrist. Her skin was ice cold. Despite the heat from the stove, the welt was raw, an angry red circle where the rope had bit deep, chafing the skin away. He opened the tin. His fingers, broad and scarred from wire and splintered wood, were surprisingly steady. He dipped 2 fingers into the dark salve and, without ceremony, spread it over the raw skin. Tamsin hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and tried to pull away. The salve stung like fire. "Hold still," he commanded, his grip tightening just enough to anchor her. He didn't acknowledge her pain. He just continued the work, his touch firm and impersonal, spreading the medicine. Then he picked up the bandage. He began to wrap her wrist, his movements practiced and neat. Each pass of the white cloth covered the ugly, raw wound. Each wrap was a question he didn't voice. Who did this? Why? How long? The silence in the room thickened, broken only by the bubbling pot and the sharp crackle of a log shifting in the stove. Tamsin's breathing was shallow, her eyes fixed on his hands. He finished the knot, pulling it tight with a single, efficient tug. He started to pull back, but her voice, a dry whisper, stopped him. "It was at Dove's Bluff." Rowan paused, his hand still hovering over her newly bandaged wrist. He looked at her. "The Hale Plantation," she continued, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. She spoke in short, broken bursts, as if each word was a painful stone she had to cough up. "That's where I worked, in the kitchens. That's where he killed her." Rowan settled back on his heels, waiting. He set the fire to hide it, to hide what he did to Amelia. Her good hand clenched into a fist in her lap. He told everyone, he told the town it was a raid, that the natives had come, that they'd burned the place. Her voice was thick with a loathing so deep it was almost physical. Anyone who said different, anyone who even looked like they might, he called them savage sympathizers. He made it a white man's problem. She looked at her bandaged wrist, turning it over, as if seeing it for the first time. "This," she said, her voice dropping. "This wasn't from them. This was from him, from Hale." Rowan's eyes narrowed. "He caught you." She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "I ran, but not fast enough. Not at first. He and his men, they caught me at the edge of town, by the big cottonwood, the one by the dry goods store." She stopped. The memory was clearly a hard one, a place she did not want to revisit. The stove popped, a spark against the iron, making her jump. "He didn't just chase me," she whispered, forcing the words out. "He wanted to make an example. He tied me to the tree, my hands high, so everyone coming in for supplies could see me." Rowan's face remained a mask, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. This went beyond a simple manhunt. This was cruelty. "He put a sign on me," she said, her voice cracking. She swallowed, fighting for control. "A piece of cratewood. He wrote on it, 'No white man forgives.' He wanted everyone to see. He wanted them to think I was part of the raid." She took a shuddering breath. "I was there for hours. The Sun people just walked by. They just looked. But then," she continued, her voice hardening, "he changed his mind. He came back, drunker. He tore the sign down. He said a raid wasn't good enough. He needed a thief, someone whose word was dirt. He nailed up a new sign. This one said, "Don't forgive her." He told the town I'd been caught stealing his horse. And his knife. She gestured to the pistol at her waist. He wanted me brought in for theft, so that if I ever spoke, if I ever told anyone what I saw, what he did to Amelia, who would believe a horse thief, who would believe a savage. Rowan finally understood the $60 bounty. It wasn't just to silence a witness. It was to purchase a reputation, to retroactively destroy her character so the truth could never find purchase. "So how did you—" he started. "A widow," Tamsin said, a flicker of something soft in her eyes. "Mrs. Albright. She lives in the small house behind the church. Her husband took a fever last winter. She's quiet, but she sees things. She came in the night, long after midnight. I thought it was him again, but it was her. She had a kitchen knife." Tamsin's voice was full of a fragile awe. "She just cut the ropes. She didn't say much. Just, God doesn't forgive a man who uses a woman's pain for his own lies. She gave me water. And this." Slowly, Tamsin's free hand went to the collar of her torn shirt. She fumbled inside, her fingers searching. She pulled out a small, folded object. It was a tiny square of rough-spun cloth, maybe 2 inches by 2 inches, folded over. It was faded blue. She held it out to him on her palm. Rowan looked at it. It was a charm, a talisman. "She gave it to me," Tamsin said. "She told me to run west, toward the arroyo, to just run." Rowan picked it up. It was light as a feather, but the stitching was heavy, done with thick black thread. The stitches were small, tight, and certain. They were sewn with the kind of grim determination that comes from loss. He unfolded it. It was a crude embroidery, a small, simple bird, just a few lines of thread, with its wings spread wide, and beneath it, 2 broken lines, representing a cage. "A sparrow?" Tamsin whispered, though she didn't need to. "Escaping the cage." Rowan stared at the little cloth charm. He felt the thick, hard stitches under his thumb. This small, secret act of defiance, this one woman, with a kitchen knife and a needle, who had stood against Sutter Hale's lie. His gaze lifted from the charm. He looked at Tamsin, but as he did, his focus shifted, drifted past her, to the memory of the blue woolen scarf, his brother's scarf. "The Snaremen," he said. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Tamsin looked up, startled by the change in his voice. It had gone from flat and watchful to something else, something dark. "This isn't my first time seeing their work," he said. His face changed. He was no longer in the warm kitchen, smelling beans and pine tar. He was in the snow, 2 winters gone. The wind was a blade, the air so cold it cracked. He saw his brother, Silas, just 18, all lanky limbs and foolish courage. He saw the blue scarf, the one he'd knitted himself, wrapped tight around Silas's neck. He heard the horses screaming. The Snaremen had come just before dawn, not for murder, just for horses. They were horse thieves then, before they'd graduated to hunting men for $60. They wore the same battered tin hats. "They came for the horses," Rowan said, his voice a low, dead monotone. He was speaking to the charm, not to her, just the horses. "We only had 4. Silas, he was always the brave one, the foolish one. He ran out of the house. He had an old shotgun, loaded with rock salt. He thought he could scare them off." Rowan's hand, the one not holding the charm, clenched into a fist. "I was in the barn," he said, "checking a loose buckle on my cinch. I heard him yell. I was a second behind him, just 1 second, 1 slow beat of the heart." He looked up, and his eyes met Tamsin's. His were filled with a cold, dead winter she hadn't seen before. "They didn't just take the horses," he said. They quieted the alarm. By the time I got to him, the snow was—" He stopped. "I was slow," he said, the words simple, brutal, and final. 1 second. It cost a grave. The two stories hung in the air, side by side. Her story of a widow's bravery, his story of a brother's loss, her story of being tied and branded, his story of being too slow. And in the middle, the snare men, the men outside. The two stories twisted together, braided into a single, unspoken decision. They would not be slow again. Rowan looked down at the small cloth charm in his hand. The sparrow, the broken cage. He didn't give it back to her. He stood up and walked to the small kitchen table. He placed the charm in the very center, on the scarred wood, where the lamplight caught it. "Leave it here," he said. His voice was changed. It was no longer flat. It was settled. It was hard as iron. "This house, this'll be the safe cage. For now." Tamsin watched him. She slowly, painfully, got to her feet, using the chair to help her. She stood, favoring her bad ankle, and looked at him across the table. And for the first time, Rowan Pike saw her eyes. He had seen the terror. He had seen the defiance. He had seen the grief. Now, he saw something else. Her gaze was not the gaze of a victim. It was not a plea for help. It was a clear, steady, measuring look. She was weighing him. She was seeing the man who had been 1 second too slow, and she was calculating. She was measuring his guilt against her own desperation, and seeing if, together, they added up to a weapon. The silence returned, but it was a different silence. It was the quiet of an accord being struck. The stove crackled, a log popping and sending a brief flare of light across the room. The air was thick with the smell of the bean stew, the sharp scent of the pine salve, and something else. Rowan turned his head slightly, sniffing the air coming from the chimney draft. "Rain," he said, "far off, but it's coming. It'll cover our tracks." He turned, grabbed a tin bowl and a spoon from a shelf. He walked to the stove, ladled a heavy scoop of the thick beans into the bowl, and walked back to the table. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't coddle her. He slid it across the wood, the bowl stopping just short of the cloth sparrow. Tamsin looked at the steam rising from the bowl. She looked at the man. She looked at the charm. She pulled the bowl closer. She picked up the spoon. Her hand was shaking, but she got it to her mouth. She ate one spoonful, then another. She ate not like a wild thing, but like a person who had forgotten what food tasted like. She ate until the bowl was half empty. Then she stopped, the spoon halfway to her mouth. She looked at Rowan Pike, her eyes clear, the firelight reflecting in them. "Thank you," she said. The words were quiet, but in the small, besieged kitchen, they landed with the force of a gunshot. The last of the light was dying. It bled out of the sky, draining from copper to a deep, bruised purple. The wind had dropped, and the world had gone utterly still, holding its breath. This was the dangerous time. The tweenlight, too dark to see clearly, too light to hide completely. Inside the small kitchen, Rowan Pike blew out the single kerosene lamp. The room plunged into a thick, expectant blackness. The only light came from the stove, a faint orange glow from the air vent. "Now," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the quiet. He had been listening for the past hour, his head tilted toward the window. Tamsin had been watching him, her own senses stretched thin, flinching at every scrape of a branch, every shift of the settling house. Then they both heard it. It wasn't a sound. At first, it was a vibration, a rhythmic, subtle thrum that came through the soles of their boots. It was the synchronized beat of shod hooves on hard, dry earth. They were coming. Not from the ridge this time. They were circling, coming in from the east, using the last of the light as their cover. "Stable," Rowan whispered. "Stay behind me. Step where I step." He didn't use the kitchen door. He led her through the small, dark parlor to a side door, one that opened onto the narrow gap between the house and the woodshed. He opened it a crack. The air was cold, smelling of the promised rain. He slipped out, a shadow detaching from a shadow. Tamsin followed, her bad ankle making her limp pronounced. But she was silent, biting her lip against the pain. They reached the stable. The horses were nervous, their ears pricked, snorting softly in their stalls. Rowan didn't light a lamp. He moved by feel, his hands finding the bridles, the buckles, the saddles in the familiar dark. He saddled Ghost Lantern and his own horse, a tough-looking bay. He left the roan mare Tamsin had first tried. She was too spent. "No time for the roan," he said, as if sensing Tamsin's backward glance. "She'll slow us. They can have her." He handed Tamsin the reins to Ghost Lantern. "When I say, not before." He moved to the stable's back wall, to a small gap in the planking he used for ventilation. He peered out. The riders were in the yard. 4 of them. They were just shapes, dark cutouts against the purple sky. 3 wore the battered tin hats that marked them as snare men. The 4th man sat taller in his saddle, his hat a clean, creased Stetson. He wore a long duster, and even in the gloom, Rowan could see the glint of a tin star on his chest. "That's him," Tamsin breathed, her voice a knot of fear from just behind Rowan's shoulder. "The one with the star. That's Cade Merritt, Hale's new deputy." Merritt's voice cut through the stillness, loud and confident. "Pike, we know you're in there. We got a warrant for the girl, Tamsin Redbird. Complicity in murder and theft. Send her out, and we'll forget you harbored her." Rowan said nothing. He watched Merritt. The man was enjoying this. "Last chance." "Pike," Merritt yelled. "We don't want to smoke you out, but that wind's picking up. A fire catches real nice in this dry air." Rowan turned from the peephole. He looked at Tamsin. Her face was a pale oval in the darkness, her eyes wide. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed to the back of the stable, toward the hay shed. He led her not to the main door, but to a low opening in the back, designed for loading hay. He slid the small wooden panel aside. It opened onto a narrow, dark space behind the stable. "Stay low," he whispered. "Don't stand." He went first, dropping to his hands and knees and crawling into the open. Tamsin followed, her breath coming in short, sharp huffs. They were behind the hay shed, a long, low structure. Before them lay a shallow depression in the earth, barely 2 feet deep. It was an old irrigation ditch, long since dry, choked with weeds. It ran from the well, past the hay shed, and snaked its way west toward the dark line of the arroyo. It was their only way out. "In," Rowan ordered. He slid into the ditch, his back pressing against the cold, damp earth. Tamsin tumbled in after him. They lay side by side, their shoulders touching, staring up at the darkening strip of sky. "Crawl," he said. "On your back. Use your heels." It was slow, agonizing work. They pushed themselves backward with their feet, their backs scraping the dirt and dry roots. The ditch was their shield. It kept them below the line of sight of the men in the yard. From the front of the house, they heard Merritt's voice, impatient. "Fine, have it your way, Abram. Check the stable." There was a creak of leather as a man dismounted. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Rowan and Tamsin froze. The footsteps were moving along the side of the stable, coming closer. They lay perfectly still. Rowan could hear Tamsin's breathing, a panicked, shallow sound next to his ear. He could smell the smoke that still clung to her clothes, mixed with the sharp scent of the pine salve on her wrist. A shape appeared at the corner of the hay shed, not 20 feet away, a man in a tin hat, a rifle in his hand. He stood, listening. "Rowok, this is where it gets tight." Rowan and Tamsin didn't breathe. The silence stretched. The man in the tin hat was a statue. Then came the sounds, amplified by the terror and the quiet. The jingle of a spur, the soft, wet snort of a horse from the yard, the creak of saddle leather as one of the other riders shifted his weight. The snareman by the shed took one step closer. Then another. He was 10 paces away. Rowan could hear the man's breathing. A low, nasal whistle. He could smell the sour scent of cheap whiskey on him. The man was looking right at the ditch, but the shadows were deep. He hadn't seen them. Not yet. He lifted his rifle, about to take another step, one that would bring him right on top of them. Rowan had to act. His left hand, which had been lying flat in the dirt, moved. Not toward the man. It moved toward a thin, almost invisible strand of wire that ran along the edge of the ditch. It was a line Rowan had strung himself years ago, leading from the house to a post on the far fence line. He'd tied an old, cracked cowbell to it, to warn him if coyotes were near the chickens. His fingers found the wire. He pulled just a single sharp tug. Far off, in the darkness on the other side of the yard, a faint, lonely sound broke the night. Clang, kay, lang, lang. The cowbell, rusty and forgotten, rang out like a ghost in the night. The wind, which had begun to rise again, caught it, making it swing. Clang. The snareman by the shed spun, his rifle coming up. "What in the—" "What is it?" Merritt's voice snapped from the yard. "Over by the far fence," the snareman yelled. "Something moved. The bell." Merritt swore, a long, ugly string of curses. "It's a trick she's running." Crack, crack. 2 rifle shots tore the night apart. Merritt fired blind into the darkness where the bell had sounded. In the ensuing chaos, a flock of crows, roosting in the cottonwood by the gate, burst into the air, cawing and screaming. In the poor light, their frantic, scattering shapes looked like people, running in all directions. "There they go!" another man yelled. "They're scattering!" "After 'em!" Merritt roared. Hoofbeats thundered as 2 of the riders charged, firing at the fleeing birds, tricked by the sound and the shadows. "Now," Rowan breathed. "Move!" They scrambled backward in the ditch, heels digging, backs scraping. They had 50 yards to go. The snareman who had been by the shed, Abram, didn't follow the others. He was smarter. He stood, listening, his head turning. He knew the shots were a diversion. Tamsin looked at Rowan. Her face was a mask of panic. The ditch was moving too slow. She lifted a hand, 2 fingers extended, and pointed. Not straight ahead, but to the left. She pointed to a dark, overgrown tangle of mesquite. Rowan frowned. "What?" "Ditch," she whispered, her voice frantic. "An old one. Leads to the gulch, Saucer Gulch. It's faster." She had seen it. On her desperate run to his ranch, she had seen the lay of the land. Rowan made the decision instantly. "Go!" They rolled out of the shallow irrigation ditch and onto their hands and knees, scrambling for the dark patch of mesquite. "Hey!" The voice was from behind them. Abram. He hadn't seen them, but he'd heard the scrape of gravel. A shot rang out, wild, whining off a rock near Rowan's head. "Get down!" Rowan shoved Tamsin forward. They plunged into the mesquite. It was a deeper, narrower trench, barely a furrow, hidden by the thorny bushes. They fell into it, one on top of the other, landing hard. They were in, but Tamsin cried out, a sharp, bitten-off sound. "What?" Rowan hissed. "Stuck," she panted. "My shirt, it's caught." He turned in the narrow ditch. Her torn linen shirt was snagged fast on a long, hooked thorn. She pulled, but it held, ripping the fabric further. "Hold still." He reached back. His fingers fumbled in the dark, brushing her arm, her shoulder. He found the thorn. It was snagged deep. "They're in the brush," Abram's voice. "Closer now." Rowan grabbed the fabric with one hand and the branch with the other. He couldn't gentle it. He just tore it free. Rip. The sound was loud. His hand, as it pulled the fabric away, brushed her arm, his fingertips, rough and calloused, slid across the soft skin of her inner wrist, just above the new bandage. Her skin was burning hot, alive with adrenaline and fear. It was a strange, electric touch in the cold dark. It lasted only a second, but it stopped the world. Then the world came crashing back. A light flared behind them. Abram had seen the scuff marks where they'd entered the ditch. "They're in here," he yelled. "Merritt, they're in the gulch." Another shape appeared. Cade Merritt, on foot. "They won't get far." Merritt snarled. He looked back toward the stable, his eyes glinting. "Abram, flush him out. Give him a little light." Abram laughed, a low, ugly sound. He turned back to the stable, fumbled with something. A match struck. A flame flared, illuminating his hard, cruel face. He was holding a torch, a rag dipped in kerosene and tied to a stick. "The hay," Tamsin whispered, her voice hollow with horror. "No," Abram said, his voice loud enough for them to hear. "Not the hay, just a little smoke." He drew his arm back and threw the torch. It sailed in a high, orange arc, not toward the hay shed, but through the open door of the main stable, their stable, where the horses were. "No!" Tamsin screamed, a raw, broken sound. Rowan reacted without thinking. It wasn't about the mission. It wasn't about escape. It was his home. It was his animals. He burst from the ditch, running low. "Get to the horses! Get them out!" he yelled at Tamsin. He didn't run for the ditch. He ran for the water trough. "Well, looky here," Abram crowed. Seeing him, he raised his rifle. But Rowan was already moving. Next to the trough, he kept a thick wool blanket, soaked in water, for just this purpose. For fire. He grabbed the sopping, heavy blanket just as the torch landed in the hay of the first stall. The dry straw went up with a whoosh of flame. Rowan charged into the stable, the blanket held high. The bay horse was screaming, rearing in its stall. "Get back!" Rowan roared, swinging the heavy, wet blanket. "Whump!" He smothered the flames, beating them down. The blanket hissed, and a cloud of thick, acrid smoke filled the stable, choking him, burning his eyes. Tamsin was already at Ghost Lantern's stall, fumbling with the latch, coughing. "I can't, it's stuck." "Hit it!" Rowan yelled, beating back a second lick of flame that had caught the wall. Tamsin slammed her shoulder into the wooden latch, and it burst open. She lunged in, grabbing the stallion's reins, pulling the terrified animal out. Outside to the arroyo go. Rowan shoved her and the horse toward the back door. He turned to his own bay, which was wild-eyed, kicking the stall. He grabbed the reins, unlocked the latch, and dragged the horse out. The fire was dead, just a smoking, stinking, smoldering pile of wet straw, but the stable was full of smoke. "They're coming out the back," he heard Merritt shout. Rowan mounted his bay in one fluid motion, dragging Tamsin up onto Ghost Lantern's back. "Ride," he yelled, slapping the stallion's rump. "Ride for the arroyo!" The two horses burst from the back of the smoking stable, charging into the darkness. They galloped across the last 50 yards of open ground, two pale ghosts against the dark earth. They reached the edge. It was a sharp, sudden drop, maybe 20 feet down. The Ghost Water Arroyo, a wide, sandy-bottomed canyon carved by a million years of flash floods. And in that moment, the moon finally broke free of the clouds. A single, brilliant shaft of white light poured into the canyon, illuminating the pale sand of the dry creek bed. It looked like a highway, a silver road, leading to freedom. Tamsin and Rowan reined in their horses at the edge, the animals skittering, their hooves sending gravel tumbling into the blackness. A voice, filled with rage and frustration, echoed from the ranch house behind them. It was Cade Merritt, screaming into the night. "You can run, Pike, but you won't make it past the border. You hear me? That's Hale's territory. You and that little savage are dead. You're dead." Rowan Pike didn't look back. He just stared down the silver road. His jaw tightened until the muscle ached, his teeth grinding. The threat didn't scare him. It just settled him. It made his purpose hard as stone. He looked at Tamsin. She was looking at him, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide and bright in the moonlight, her chest heaving. He nodded. Once. He gathered his reins, his grip sure and hard, and together they spurred their horses, launching them down the loose gravel slope and into the silver, silent emptiness of the arroyo. They rode for hours. The silver road of the arroyo twisted and turned, a pale sandy ribbon cutting through the black, rising cliffs. The moon was their only guide, and it was a treacherous one, casting shadows that looked like solid walls and turning harmless bushes into crouching, monstrous shapes. They pushed the horses hard, walking them over loose rock, trotting them across packed sand, their hoofbeats muffled by the soft earth. Behind them, there was silence. No pursuit, no shouts, just the rising, mournful sound of the wind, the one that carried the smell of rain. By the time the moon was high and small, a cold, distant eye in the sky, Rowan knew they had to stop. Tamsin was slumping in the saddle, her body swaying with each step of the horse. The adrenaline that had fueled her was gone, leaving only a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion. His own arms ached, and the smoke from the stable fire had left his throat raw, his eyes burning. He saw the place he was looking for. On the north face of the canyon, a section of the cliff had been eroded by eons of wind, leaving a deep, concave overhang. The rock was pockmarked with thousands of small, dark holes, like a giant, petrified honeycomb. It was a shallow cave, not deep, but it was shelter. It was defensible from one side, and its stony roof would protect them from the coming rain. "In here," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He dismounted, his legs stiff. He walked into the overhang, his boots crunching on the gravel. He took Tamsin's rein, and she all but fell from the saddle. He caught her by the elbow, his grip steadying her, and for a moment she leaned on him, her entire weight sagging. She was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a body that had reached its absolute limit. "Easy," he said, the word gruff. He led her deeper into the shelter, to the back wall, and sat her down, her back against the cold, pock-marked stone. He picketed the horses at the mouth of the shelter, just out of the wind, giving them the last of his grain in their nose bags. They were their lives. Then he began the work of survival. He gathered dry, deadfall mesquite from the edges of the shelter, small, brittle sticks that would burn hot and fast with little smoke. He found a recess in the rock, a natural chimney, and built his fire there, shielding it from the wind and from view. He struck a match. The small flame flared, casting his face in a stark, momentary mask of shadow and light. Tamsin watched him from the back of the cave. She watched his hands, large and scarred, as they carefully, patiently fed the small flame. The fire caught. It was not a bonfire. It was a small, contained, breathing thing, a circle of warmth and life in the immense, cold dark. It threw a flickering, unsteady light, painting the honeycomb rock in moving shades of orange and red. Rowan sat on his heels, feeding it, his rifle resting beside him. The night was cold. It was a deep, penetrating cold that found its way through their clothes and settled into their bones. The rock at their backs was like ice. Tamsin was shaking again, her teeth chattering, her arms wrapped tight around her knees. The fire was 10 feet away, but the cold air seemed to pool around her. Rowan watched her for a moment. He saw the soot on her face, the way her hair was matted with sweat and dirt. He saw the way she flinched when the wind moaned at the mouth of the cave. He stood up, his shadow leaping up the wall. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat. It was worn, the wool matted, smelling of horse and smoke and him. He walked over to her. She looked up, her eyes wide, tensing as he approached. He didn't speak, he just held the coat out. Tamsin stared at it. She looked from the coat to his face. He was offering his warmth, his protection. She hesitated. To take it was to accept a debt, to admit a weakness. But the cold was a blade, and she was so very tired. Slowly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the rough wool. She didn't take it from him. Instead, her hand closed on the lapel, and she tugged. A small, unspoken invitation. Rowan understood. He sat down beside her, his back against the same cold stone. The space was tight. He was close enough to feel the tremors running through her. Tamsin took the heavy coat and didn't put it on. She draped it. She pulled it over her own shoulders. And then, after a second's pause, she stretched it wide, pulling the other half over his. It was a blanket for two. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a wall of wool and shared warmth between them and the night. The silence that fell was different. It was no longer the silence of suspicion or terror. It was the silence of two people who had run out of words, who were simply existing, side by side, in a small circle of light. The wind howled outside the cave, a distant, lonely sound. Inside, there was only the soft pop and hiss of the fire. They talked, but their words were small, like the sticks he fed the fire. Fragments. "Your ankle," he said, looking at where it was propped up. It was swollen, dark in the firelight. "It hurts," she said simply. "We'll rest it till dawn." "They'll come." "Yes." More silence. The firelight licked at their faces. Rowan watched the flames. Tamsin watched his hands. She edged closer to the fire, extending her palms to the heat. Her left hand, the one that wasn't bandaged, caught the light. Rowan's gaze settled on it. Her hand was a map of a hard life. It wasn't just the dirt or the scraped knuckles. There were old scars, a thin, white line that ran from her thumb to her wrist, pale and puckered. A small, star-shaped burn on the back of her hand, near the knuckle. They were old wounds, long since healed, but they told a story of kitchens, or punishments, or a life that he couldn't imagine. He looked at the scars, and his face didn't change. He didn't ask. He didn't show pity. He just looked, and he acknowledged. He saw them. He saw that she was a survivor, long before he had come along. Tamsin felt his gaze. She didn't pull her hand back. She let him look. It was a silent, mutual acceptance of the damage they both carried. She turned her gaze from the fire and looked at the man beside her. His face, in the flickering light, was all hard plains and deep shadows. He was a stranger. He had roped her horse. He had saved her life. He was sharing his coat. He had seen her scars and said nothing. The tension in her, the coil that had been wound tight for days, for years, finally, fractionally, unwound. She leaned. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement. She tilted her head, and slowly, cautiously, she rested her forehead against the rough wool covering his shoulder. It was not a request. It was a statement. "I am tired. I cannot hold this up alone anymore. Just for this minute, I will not." It was a thank you, spoken not with words, but with the simple, profound weight of her trust. Rowan Pike went still. He could feel the fine tremble of her body through his shoulder. He could feel the heat of her skin, the soft tickle of a loose strand of her hair. He sat, rigid, for a long beat. This was a different kind of contact. It was a surrender. Slowly, so as not to spook her, he turned his head. His cheek was inches from her hair. He couldn't see her face, only the top of her head. He asked with his eyes, with a simple turn of his head, a question that made no sound. "Are you all right?" She didn't lift her head. She just nodded, a tiny, slow press of her forehead into his shoulder. "Yes." He looked at her, and she lifted her head. just enough to meet his gaze. Her eyes, in the firelight, were not black. They were a deep, clear brown, and they were full of the dancing flames. They were like looking down a deep, dark well and seeing the reflection of a star. The terror was gone. The defiance was gone. There was only a vast, aching weariness and a small, fragile spark of something else. The world shrank. The howling wind faded. The cold rock at their backs dissolved. There was only the small, warm circle of the fire and the space between their two faces. He moved slowly. It was not a lunge, not a decision. It was an inevitability, like the tide or the sun. He leaned in. She did not pull back. She met him halfway. The kiss was not what she expected. It was not the desperate, bruising kiss of a man taking something. It was not the fast, frantic kiss of passion. It was slow. It was warm. It was solid. It was the taste of smoke and salt and the cold night air. It was the feel of his lips, chapped and dry, pressing firmly, gently, against hers. It was a kiss of shared breath, a quiet question and a quiet answer. It was a kiss that said, "You are here, I am here, we are alive." Their breaths mingled, the small, warm clouds of it visible in the cold air between them. Her chest, which had been heaving with panic, found a new rhythm, a slower one, that matched the steady, solid beat of his hand, the one that had held the lariat, the one that had bandaged her wrist, came up. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her. He placed it, palm flat, on her back, between her shoulder blades. It was a gesture of support. "I am here. I will not let you fall." Her hand, the scarred one, lifted. It trembled in the air for a moment, then came to rest on the side of his neck. Her fingers were cold, but they spread, finding the strong, corded muscle. Her thumb found the pulse, the steady, living thump, thump, thump of his blood, and she just held on. They stayed that way for a long time. There was no sound but the crackle and hiss of the fire, the lao shao of their rough-spun clothes, and the soft, shared sound of their breathing. The night, like a great dark blanket, pulled in around the small cave, wrapping them in its isolating embrace. When the kiss ended, they didn't pull apart. They just shifted. He leaned his back against the rock, and she settled against him, her head resting on his chest, her ear over the solid, steady beat of his heart. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling the heavy coat tight, cocooning them both in the shared wool and warmth. They lay side by side, staring into the dying embers of the fire, and they whispered. He told her, in short, halting sentences, about Silas, about the blue scarf, about the 1 second of hesitation that had cost him his brother. She told him, her voice a low murmur against his shirt, about the kitchen at Dove's Bluff, about Amelia Hale's kindness, about the star-shaped scar on her hand, a punishment from a hot stove lid given by a cruel overseer. They traded the small, heavy, secret stones of their past, the ones they had never shown to another living soul. The intimacy was not in the kiss. It was in this, the unwrapping of the bandages they had kept on their own souls. The wind moaned, a low, lonely song outside their shelter. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing red coals, and in the deep, cold, dangerous dark of the Ghostwater Arroyo, wrapped in a single coat, 2 people, who had been utterly alone, finally slept. The dawn came, gray and cold. Rowan woke first. His arm was asleep, and his neck was stiff. He opened his eyes. Tamsin was still asleep, her face pressed into his shirt, her breathing deep and even. The soot was still on her cheek, her hair a wild tangle. He looked at her, at the woman who had tried to steal his horse, who had brought a war to his doorstep. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, disoriented, her gaze focusing on the wool of his shirt, then lifting to his face. There was a long, still moment. The morning was here. The world had returned. There was no shame in her eyes, no regret. She just looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. And in that look, he saw that something fundamental had shifted. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid, and very dangerous resolve. They were no longer a man and a fugitive. They were a we. The cold light of dawn was a betrayal. It crept into the honeycomb shelter, turning the warm, shared darkness of the night into a harsh, gray, tactical reality. Rowan Pike was the first to move. He untangled himself from Tamsin and the heavy coat, the loss of his warmth making her stir and wake instantly, her hand flying to the pistol at her waist. Her eyes snapped open, and the brief, soft memory of the night was burned away by the cold. Present danger. "They'll be moving," he said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at her. He was already kicking dirt onto the glowing embers of their fire, smothering them, his movements economical and final. He was a man of action again. The night's confessions were a luxury they could no longer afford. Tamsin scrambled to her feet, wincing as her weight came down on the swollen, purple mass of her ankle. The pain was a sharp, clear spike. She pushed it down. Pain was a fact, not a barrier. Rowan stamped the last of the embers into fine, cold ash. He knew, even as he did it, that it was a futile gesture. He was leaving a sign. The snaremen would find this place. The only question was when. "We move," he said. He gathered their meager supplies, saddled the horses, his hands checking every buckle by feel in the gloom. Tamsin stood, her back to the rock, her hand on her pistol, watching the mouth of the cave. They were a unit now. He prepared. She watched. They didn't ride down the main arroyo. That was a trap. Rowan led the horses up a narrow, crumbling side path, a game trail that climbed out of the canyon's deep shadows and onto the high desert plain. The sun was just breaking the horizon, and it was a merciless, accusatory eye. They walked for an hour, the horses slipping on the loose shale, the landscape a vast, empty, terrifying expanse of gray saltbush and juniper. Rowan was moving with purpose, heading toward a cluster of balancing rocks that looked like a giant's abandoned game of marbles. Tucked behind the rocks, so low to the ground it was almost invisible, was a small structure. It wasn't a house. It was a dugout, its roof made of thick sod and bleached timber, looking more like a swell in the earth than a human habitation. A thin, lazy plume of mesquite smoke rose from a tin pipe. "Stay here," Rowan said. He handed Tamsin the reins to both horses and walked into the open. He didn't call out. He just stood, waiting. The rough plank door of the dugout opened. A woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. She was maybe 50, her skin the color of a walnut, her black hair streaked with iron gray and pulled back in a severe, tight bun. She held a heavy skinning knife in one hand as if it were a kitchen utensil, which it was. Her eyes were black, sharp, and they missed nothing. She saw Rowan, and her face did not change. She simply nodded, once. "Pike," she said. Her voice was like her, dry and tough. "Alma," he replied. Her gaze shifted past him, to Tamsin, who stood half hidden by the horses, a tense, feral silhouette against the dawn. Alma Reyes looked at Tamsin, at the torn shirt, the soot-stained face, the pistol. Then she looked back at Rowan. "You're in deep," she said. It wasn't a question. "Snaremen," Rowan said. 4 of them, maybe 5, led by the deputy, Merritt, and Abram Kincaid. At the name Kincaid, Alma's lips thinned. She knew the name. Everyone in this territory knew the name. "That's a bad debt, Rowan." "I need water," he said, ignoring the comment. "And I need the route." Alma stared at him for a long beat. Her gaze drifted, for just a second, toward the arroyo, miles distant, shimmering in the new light. "The flood. Winter of '81, she said, her voice quiet. "My boy, Mateo. You pulled him from the water when the rope broke. I owe you a life." She nodded. "This squares us. Bring the horses. Hide them behind the cistern." She turned and disappeared back into the dugout. Tamsin limped forward, leading the horses. "Who is she?" "Alma Reyes," Rowan said. "She runs the Ojo Escondido, the Hidden Eye. It's the only clean water station between here and the border. She sells water to men who don't like to be seen." Alma reemerged, her hands full. She carried 2 full canteens, which she handed to Rowan, and a long, dark brown woolen coat, stained and rough. She also had a dark shawl. She shoved them at Tamsin. "Put these on," Alma commanded. "They're looking for a woman in a torn white shirt. You look like a hunted rabbit. Try to look like a goat herder, and stay off the horse. A woman on a horse. They'll shoot from a mile away. A goat herder on foot. They might just watch." Tamsin quickly pulled the heavy, scratchy coat on over her torn shirt. It smelled of wood smoke and sheep. She wrapped the shawl over her head, tucking her wild hair under it, obscuring her face. The transformation was instant. She was no longer a fugitive. She was just a poor, anonymous woman of the high desert. "They split," Alma said, giving Rowan a piece of hard jerky, which he took with a nod. "I saw them at first light, from my roof. They're smart. Damn them! The deputy! Merritt! He took 3 men. They're riding hard down the main arroyo, following your tracks. They think to catch you at the pass." "And the others?" Rowan asked, his jaw tight. "2 of them. Kincaid, the one with the dented hat, and another. They didn't follow. They're flanking. They took the high trail, through the Salt Hills. They know this land. They're planning to pinch you. They'll catch you between the hammer and the anvil." Rowan processed this. A chess game. "They're moving faster than we are." "Which is why you're not taking the main route," Alma said. She pointed south, toward a sheer, impassive wall of red rock. "You take the knife's edge. It's a goat path. It'll shave half a day off your ride. It will put you out on the high overlook, above the Ghostwater Valley. They won't expect it. They think you're trapped in the canyon, but you'll be above them." Rowan nodded. "The horses—" "It's a goat path. Pike, not a road. You'll have to lead them. Be careful. One slip, they're gone." She turned to go. "Alma," Rowan said. She paused. "Thank you." Alma just grunted. "You saved Mateo. I paid the debt. We're square. Now get off my land. You bring a bad wind with you." She vanished back into the earth. Rowan and Tamsin looked at each other. The plan was set. "We have to split their attention," Rowan said, his mind already working. He looked at the trail leading away from Alma's. It split, one fork heading south to the main arroyo where Merritt was, the other heading west, toward the Salt Hills and Kincaid. "They're hunting 2 different trails," he said. He looked at Tamsin. "Let's give them a third." He walked to a thick, dead greasewood bush. He broke off a large, heavy branch, thick with dry, brittle limbs. He tied it to the saddle horn of his own horse with a short length of rope. "The dust trap," he said. "We're on foot, but I'll drag this. It'll scuff our tracks, make it look like we're still mounted, maybe even have a pack horse. It'll make Merritt's men think they're on the right trail, and it'll make them slow down to read the sign." Tamsin watched him, her mind catching up. She understood. This was a game of lies. She reached into her own pocket, and her fingers closed on the small, cloth charm. The sparrow in the broken cage. She pulled it out. She looked at Rowan. "He gave me this," she said, nodding back toward Alma's. "The coat, the shawl. She's like Mrs. Albright." Tamsin limped to the fork in the trail. She looked at the path leading to Merritt. She looked at the path leading to Kincaid. Then she looked at the third path, the barely visible goat trail that was the knife's edge. She didn't take that path. She walked 20 paces down the wrong trail, the one leading toward the Salt Hills, where Kincaid was. She found a low-hanging juniper branch, and she tied the small cloth charm to it, where it hung, fluttering in the breeze. Rowan came up beside her. "Why?" "Alma," Tamsin said, her voice quiet but certain. "She's on our side, but she's not done. She'll be watching. When she sees the tracks split, she won't know which way we went. This is a sign. For her, she'll see it. She'll know we didn't go this way. And she'll know to send her bad wind to the other fork. To Merritt." Rowan looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a strategist. "Good," was all he said. They turned and took the third path, the knife's edge. Rowan went first, leading his horse, the greasewood branch dragging behind, kicking up a small, plausible cloud of dust. Tamsin followed, leading Ghost Lantern. The sun was their enemy. It was high now, a brutal, white-hot spotlight. "Stay on the shadow side," Rowan ordered, his voice tight. They were on an exposed ridge, and he was hugging the western face, keeping them in the rock's long morning shadow. "You crest a ridge, you're a silhouette. A silhouette is a target. We stay low. We stay in the shadow. Don't talk, don't kick a loose stone." They moved in a tense, agonizing silence. Tamsin's ankle was a screaming fire, but she didn't make a sound. She just bit her lip, wrapped the shawl tighter, and matched his pace. The memory of the night, of his hand on her back, of his whispered confession, was a strange, warm fuel that kept her moving. An hour passed. 2. The sun was relentless. Then they heard it. It was thin, high, and reedy. It cut through the air, chilling them to the bone. Wee, Trill." A tin whistle, a signal. Tamsin froze, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" "They found the cave," Rowan said. He didn't stop. "They found the cold ashes. They're on us. They're an hour back, maybe less." He pulled the horse faster. Scrambling up a steep incline, they could hear, faintly, the sounds of men shouting. Far below them in the main arroyo. "Wee Trill!" The whistle came again, closer this time. Tamsin's breath hitched. They were being hunted, and the hunters were gaining. And then, a new sound. From far off, in the canyon below them, the other canyon, where Merritt and his 3 men were, where Tamsin hadn't left the charm, a sudden, chaotic noise erupted. Clang, jingle, clang, clang, rattle. It was the sound of a dozen cowbells and the clatter of what sounded like empty pots. All at once, echoing up the canyon walls, mixed with the braying of mules. Rowan stopped, a slow, grim smile touching his lips for the first time. He looked back in the direction of Alma's dugout. "Alma," he breathed. Down in the canyon, Cade Merritt, hearing the sudden noise from a side canyon ahead of him, reined in his horse. "What in blazes is that? It's them. They're in the rocks. They're trying to break for the ridge after him." He and his men spurred their horses, firing their rifles at the source of the sound 3 of Alma's pack mules, laden with bells and pans, which she had sent clattering down a rock slide. The gunshots echoed up to Rowan and Tamsin. The diversion, it had worked. Merritt was off, chasing ghosts and mules. "That bought us time," Rowan said. "Kincaid heard that. He'll be confused. He'll have to wait. Let's move." He plunged into a narrow crack in the rock wall. This was the knife's edge. The world vanished. They were in a claustrophobic, vertical gully, so narrow they had to turn sideways to get through. The horses balked, their eyes wide, but Rowan pulled them, forcing them into the gap. The walls rose 100 feet on either side, sheer and smooth. And the wind, it roared through the gully, funneled into a high, screaming shree. It sounded like a flute, like 1,000 women wailing. It tore at their clothes, filled their ears, and thankfully masked every sound they made. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, scrambling over rocks, pulling the terrified horses, their lungs burning from the altitude and the exertion. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. They stumbled out of the crack, blinking, into the blinding high noon sun. They were on a precipice. The world fell away at their feet. Below them, stretching for 100 miles, was the Ghostwater Valley. It was a vast, shimmering, white and silver expanse. The heat haze rising from the salt flats made it look like a shimmering, spectral ocean. The border. They had made it. They were above their pursuers, with a clear line to freedom. Tamsin let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she'd run from the fire. A shaky, tearful laugh escaped her. She leaned against Ghost Lantern, her legs trembling. Rowan Pike did not relax. His rifle was in his hand. He was scanning the valley floor, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He was checking the path down. There was only one, a steep, treacherous switchback that led from their perch down to the valley floor, 1,000 feet below. And he saw it. He saw him. Tamsin saw his body go rigid. What is it?" Rowan didn't answer. He just lifted his arm and pointed. At the bottom of the switchback, where the path met the valley floor, a lone rider sat on a black horse. He was sitting perfectly still, a single dark shape in the overwhelming white. He was too far to make out his face, but he didn't need to. The man was staring right up at them, as if he had been waiting for them all morning. He hadn't followed Merritt. He hadn't been fooled by the mules. He hadn't bothered with the tracks in the salt hills. He had simply gone to the exit. He had let his pawns chase the board, while he had waited at the end of the game. The sun glinted off the man's head. It wasn't hair, it was metal. A battered tin hat with a single, deep, crescent-shaped dent in the front, like a third, dark eye. Abram Kincaid. The silence on the precipice was absolute. 1,000 feet below them. Abram Kincaid sat on his black horse, a single, patient, dark speck against the blinding white of the Ghostwater salt flats. He was at the nexus, the exact point where the treacherous switchback met the valley floor. He was the toll. Rowan Pike let out a slow breath. The heat was already rising from the valley, a physical, wavy force. He looked at Tamsin. The momentary relief she had felt was gone, replaced by a cold, hard understanding. "He didn't chase us," she said, her voice flat. "He just waited." "He's smart," Rowan said, his voice a low rasp. "Smarter than Merritt. He let the dogs chase the rabbit while he waited at the mouth of the burrow." He checked his rifle, the action slick and oiled. He knew this was the only way down. Tamsin looked at the switchback. It was a narrow, crumbling goat path, a series of Z's carved into the sheer cliff face. To go down it was to put themselves in Kincaid's line of fire for 30 minutes. They were exposed. "It's a trap," she said. "It's the only door," Rowan replied. He looked at her, his eyes clear. "We can't stay up here. Merritt and the others will find this trail eventually. We'll be caught between them." He untied the greasewood branch from his saddle. The dust trap no longer needed. The game of deception was over. This was the final play. "We go down," he said. "We lead the horses. Stay tight to the cliff wall. It will give us some cover. Walk slow. A loose rock will give him a target." He started down, leading his bay. Tamsin followed, her hand white on Ghost Lantern's rein, her bad ankles screaming in protest as she navigated the steep decline. The descent was an agony of suspense. The wind was quiet here, pressed against the hot rock. The only sounds were the slide of their boots on loose shale and the nervous snorts of the horses. Rowan didn't look down. He focused on his feet. He could feel Kincaid's gaze on him, a physical weight on his shoulders. Tamsin's ankle twisted. She let out a small, sharp gasp of pain, sending a shower of pebbles clattering down the path. Rowan froze. Below, Kincaid didn't move. He didn't raise his rifle. He just sat, watching them, letting them come. He was enjoying this. He was a spider, and they were walking, step by painful step, into his web. It took them almost half an hour. When they finally stepped onto the flat white, sun-baked earth of the valley floor, the heat enveloped them. It was like stepping into a furnace. The air shimmered. Rowan let his horse's reins drop. The animal wouldn't run. There was nowhere to go. He stood, his rifle held low, and faced the man in the tin hat. Tamsin came to stand beside him, her pistol in her hand, her face streaked with sweat and pale with exhaustion. Abram Kincaid sat his horse, not 20 yards away. He was alone. He pushed his dented tin hat back on his head. His face was weathered, gaunt, with a thin, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were the color of the salt, pale, flat, and empty. He let out a sound. It wasn't a laugh. It was a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on old wood. "That was a good run. Pike," Kincaid said, his voice surprisingly soft, yet it carried perfectly in the still, hot air. "Up the arroyo, over the knife's edge. You gave my boys a real chase. I give you that." He nodded at Tamsin. "But you're still delivering the merchandise. Just a little late." His gaze slid back to Rowan. "I was just going to collect the girl, but Hale upped the price. He wants the rancher who harbored her, too. Figured I'd hang the girl, then maybe drop you for resisting. 2 rewards for 1 hat." Before Rowan could speak, Tamsin stepped forward. She took half a step, planting her good foot firmly on the salt. She was not the terrified, trembling girl from the stable. The night in the cave had burned that away. Her voice was not a scream or a plea. It was a clear, level, precise statement of fact. "Sutter Hale killed his wife, Amelia," she said. Kincaid's empty smile didn't waver. He just watched her. "He struck her down at Dove's Bluff," Tamsin continued, her voice gaining strength, cutting through the shimmering heat. "He set the house on fire to hide what he did. He was going to blame it on the natives, but I saw him light the match." She pointed a finger, not at Kincaid, but at the empty sky, as if at a judge. "He tied me to a tree to silence me. He branded me a thief and put a $60 bounty on my head so no one would ever listen to my word." She lowered her hand. "That's the truth." Kincaid let the silence stretch. He looked at Rowan, then back at Tamsin. He shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "Truth don't pay, girl," he said, the words falling like stones. $60 does. Now it's $160. Hale wants you. I want the gold. It's just business." Rowan Pike stepped up, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Tamsin. His gaze was locked on Kincaid. "Maybe," Rowan said, his voice low. "But swallowing a lie like that, it pulls a man to his grave. Kincaid, it's a heavy thing to carry." He was thinking of Silas. He was thinking of the 1 second he had been too slow. This was his shield. This was the memory that made him immovable. Kincaid's smile finally faded. His hand, which had been resting on his saddle horn, moved to his thigh, closer to the pistol holstered there. "You can wax philosophical all you want, Pike," he sneered. "But I got the only truth that matters, right here, and I ain't alone." "You sure about that, Perrault?" The voice was female, hard, and it came from above. Kincaid's head snapped up. Rowan and Tamsin spun. On the switchback, 50 feet above them, Alma Reyes stood on a flat outcrop of rock. She had not gone back to her dugout. She had followed them. She held a long-barreled scattergun, and both barrels were aimed squarely at Abram Kincaid's chest. "Alma," Rowan breathed. "I got something that matters more than a bounty." "Kincaid," Alma called down, her voice echoing slightly off the rock. "I got a letter." Kincaid squinted up at her. "What?" "A letter," she shouted. "From the widow Albright, the one who cut the girl loose. She gave it to me for safekeeping. It's from Amelia Hale herself, written the very night that animal killed her." Tamsin's hand flew to her mouth. "She wrote it," Alma yelled, her voice a righteous fury. "She knew he was coming for her. It's all in there, his threats, the drinking, her fear, the ink's all run with her tears." The air vibrated. This was it, the proof. The truth Tamsin spoke, now given paper and ink. Kincaid's body, for the first time, lost its casual arrogance. He hunched, just a fraction. He looked from Rowan to Tamsin and up to Alma. He was a man suddenly caught in a crossfire, and the bullets weren't just lead. A bounty on a fugitive was simple. A bounty on a woman who could be proven innocent by a murdered woman's last words that was a hanging offense. For him. But the hesitation lasted only a second. Greed pulled him back. The greed and the pride. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Paper," he spat. "Paper ain't gold. Paper burns. A dead witness stays a witness. But a dead girl, she stays quiet." He raised his hand, not to draw, but to signal. From the rocks on either side of the valley floor, 2 more men stepped out. 2 snaremen, their tin hats glinting, their rifles leveled. Kincaid's men. They had been waiting. 2. It was a 3-on-3 standoff, but their rifles were steady. "It's a messy count, Kincaid," Rowan said, his voice calm, calculating. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. "I make it 3-on-3, Kincaid said, his confidence flowing back. "And my men are steadier." "Maybe," Rowan said. He held up one hand, palm out. "But Alma's scattergun is aimed at your gut. She won't miss. And Tamsin's pistol is on your man to the left. I've got the one on the right. Maybe we all die right here, in this heat. Or maybe you prove you're better than me." Kincaid's eyes narrowed. "What?" "You and me," Rowan said, his voice dropping. "A fair draw. 1 shot. Winner takes the bounty. Winner takes the letter. Winner takes the girl. The losers walk away. Clean." Kincaid stared at him. He looked at Alma. He looked at his men. He looked at Rowan. Rowan was just a rancher. A farmer. Kincaid was a hunter. He trusted his speed. He trusted his cunning. This was a gift. "You'd risk her," Kincaid sneered, "on 1 shot." "I'm risking me," Rowan said, "so she doesn't have to." Kincaid laughed. A genuine barking laugh. $160. "All right, rancher. You want to die clean. That's fine by me. I'll take that deal." He held up his hand, signaling his men. "Elias, Josiah, back off. To the rocks. Lower your rifles. This is between me and the farmer." The 2 snaremen looked at each other, confused, but Kincaid was their boss. They lowered their rifles and slowly retreated, their eyes still on Rowan. The stage was clear, a white, salt-caked circle under a burning sun. Rowan turned. Just for a second, the heat was stifling. "It's too hot for this," he muttered. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, the one from the night before, and pulled it off. He tossed it unceremoniously onto a low, sharp-edged boulder nearby. He stood in just his shirt, his movements deliberate. He turned to Tamsin. Her face was pale, her eyes huge. She didn't cry. She didn't beg him not to. She just reached out, her hand trembling, and her cold fingers wrapped around his forearm, just above the elbow. She squeezed. Once. Hard. A silent, desperate message. "Come back." Rowan Pike put his hand over hers. Just for a beat. Then he let go and walked. He and Kincaid stood 20 paces apart. The wind, which had been still, picked up, swirling the fine, white salt dust around their boots in ghostly circles. Tamsin watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Alma watched from the ridge, her scattergun still held at the ready, but useless now. Kincaid's hand hovered over his pistol. He was smiling, that thin, pale-eyed smile. "Any last prayers, farmer?" Rowan said nothing. His face was a mask of stone. His hand was empty at his side. "Fine," Kincaid sneered. He drew. It was impossibly fast. A blur of motion. He didn't wait for a signal. He didn't count. He cheated. Bang! The sound was a flat, deafening crack that broke the valley's silence. Rowan was thrown back. He staggered, a look of profound shock on his face. He clutched his side. His fingers splayed. He fell. Nya! He collapsed to his knees. then pitched forward onto the salt. "No!" Tamsin's scream was a raw, broken sound. She started to run forward, but Alma's voice, sharp as a whip, snapped from the ridge. "Stay, stay, girl!" Kincaid stood, his pistol smoking in his hand, that ugly, triumphant laugh starting in his chest. "Too slow, rancher," he spat, starting to walk forward. "Just too slow." Rowan Pike pushed himself up. Kincaid's laugh died in his throat. Rowan was on his hands and knees. He was panting, his head down. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to one knee. He was alive. Bat day. He looked at Kincaid. Then he looked down at his own side. His hand was pressed against his ribs. When he pulled it away, it was covered in blood, but he was breathing. Kincaid's bullet had been fast. It had been true. But in that last split second, Rowan had turned. The bullet, aimed for his heart, had instead torn a long, bloody, agonizing graze Viandan's suat along his ribs, ripping through his shirt and skin, but missing anything vital, a quarter of an inch to the left, and he would have been dead before he hit the ground. Kincaid stared, his pistol still smoking, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He had fired. The man had fallen. But the man was getting up. Rowan Pike stood. He stood tall, his hand pressed to his bleeding side, his face pale, but his eyes were cold as winter stone. He had taken the shot. He had survived. And Abram Kincaid's gun was empty, his one shot spent. My turn. Rowan Pike breathed. The world, which had been frozen in a tableau of salt and sun, exploded into chaos. Abram Kincaid, staring in disbelief at the rancher who should be dead, let out a guttural snarl. His hand fumbled for his reloading pouch, his mind catching up to the fact that his pistol was empty. Elias Josiah, shoot him. He's just a man. Shoot him down. The two snare men in the rocks, jolted from their shock, raised their rifles. Rowan Pike didn't try to draw his own pistol. His rifle was still in his hands. He dropped to one knee, the movement not one of weakness, but of stability. The salt ground crunched beneath his boot. His side was a sheet of wet fire, the graze burning like a hot brand, but his hands were steady. He raised the rifle. He didn't aim for Kincaid. He didn't aim for the men in the rocks. He aimed for Kincaid's black horse, which was standing nervously 20 feet away. Rowan's shot was a single, flat crack. The bullet sang. It didn't strike flesh. It snapped the thick leather rein on the horse's bridle. The sound a sharp thwack, the stinging leather, the noise, the sudden freedom, it was too much for the animal. The horse screamed, a high, terrified sound, and reared, its hooves flashing in the sun. It spun, its powerful shoulders slamming into Kincaid, throwing the bounty hunter to the ground. Then it bolted, a black streak of panic, tearing across the white salt flats, taking Kincaid's saddlebags, his supplies, and his spare ammunition with it. The gunshot sent everyone into motion. Elias, the henchman on the left, stepped out from behind his rock, raising his rifle to draw a bead on the kneeling Rowan. Tamsin moved. She had seen Rowan fall. She had seen him rise. The terror that had frozen her was burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp fury. She saw Elias, his rifle leveling. She didn't have a clear shot with her old pistol. She saw Kincaid's lariat, the one he had dropped when he drew, coiled like a snake on the white ground. She lunged, grabbing the stiff, heavy rope. She didn't know how to rope a calf, but she knew how to fight. She shook out a partial loop and whipped it, underhand, like a striking adder. The loop, more by luck than skill, flew true. It snagged Elias's wrist, the rope biting deep just as he was about to pull the trigger. Tamsin didn't hesitate. She threw her entire body weight backward, yanking the rope. Elias cried out. A high, surprised sound. The rifle was torn from his grip, clattering uselessly onto the salt. He was disarmed. The battle was 3-on-3, but the scales were tipping. Then, a new voice, a new shot. Bang! A bullet kicked up a plume of white salt, stinging Rowan's cheek. It came from above. Got you now. Pike, got you in the pot. It was Cade Merritt, the deputy, hearing the gunfire echo up the canyon. Must have abandoned his mule chase and doubled back, climbing the high switchback. He was 200 yards up, perched like a hawk, his rifle smoke a small, gray puff against the red rock. He was reloading, preparing for a second, cleaner shot. Alma! Rowan yelled, but Alma was already moving. From her position on the ridge, she was too far for her scattergun to reach Merritt. She ducked, dropping her gun, and ripped open the leather satchel at her belt. She pulled out a small, round, polished brass mirror. She angled it, catching the high, merciless sun. A beam of pure, white light, as focused as a blade, shot across the canyon. It found Cade Merritt's face, striking his eyes just as he settled his rifle. "Ah, damn it!" Merritt's voice echoed, a cry of pain. He was blinded, clawing at his face, the sun's reflection burning his vision. "I can't see, I can't." Kincaid saw his chance. His horse was gone, his gun empty. But Rowan was distracted by the sniper. Tamsin was tangled with Elias and the rope. With a roar that was pure animal hate, Kincaid scrambled to his feet. He had lost his pistol, but he was not unarmed. He ripped a long, heavy-bladed skinning knife from the sheath on his belt and charged Rowan. Rowan turned, the pain in his side a dull, screaming throb. He had no time to lift his rifle. He dropped it. His hand flew to his own hip, to the lariat coiled there. Kincaid lunged, the knife flashing, aimed low for Rowan's gut. Rowan didn't retreat. He moved, his wrist flicking. It wasn't a throw. It was a snare. A short, fast loop snapped out, tightening around Kincaid's advancing wrist, the one holding the knife. Rowan yanked, pivoted on his heel, and dropped his weight, using Kincaid's own charging momentum against him. It was a single, fluid motion, a rancher's takedown, all leverage and physics. Whump! Kincaid hit the salt flat, hard. The air exploded from his lungs in a choked gasp. The knife flew from his numb fingers and skittered across the ground. The last man, Josiah, the henchman on the right, saw his leader fall. He saw Tamsin, her back to him, still holding the rope on his partner. He made his choice. He abandoned his cover, charging Tamsin from behind, his arms wide, aiming to tackle her to the ground. Tamsin heard the crunch of his boots. She dropped the lariat and spun. She didn't run. She stepped into the charge. As he lunged, she brought her good leg up, her knee driving hard into his stomach. Josiah's charge collapsed. He folded in on himself, a strangled oof of pain, his hands clutching his belly. As he doubled over, his pistol was exposed in its holster. Tamsin grabbed it. She ripped the gun free from the leather, her fingers closing around the worn wooden grip. She scrambled back 2 steps, raising the heavy weapon, her thumb finding the hammer and pulling it back. Clack! The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. Her hand was shaking, the long barrel of the pistol waving wildly. She stared at the man on the ground, her chest heaving. She took one deep, ragged breath, thought of Amelia Hale, thought of the rope burn on her wrist. Her hand became rock steady. Pwing! Merritt, his vision clearing, fired a desperate, angry shot from the ridge. He was firing blind, just aiming at the cluster of figures. The bullet tore through the air, striking the ground just behind Tamsin, kicking up a shower of stinging salt crystals that bit at her heels. She cried out, stumbling back. Rowan moved. He ignored Kincaid, who was groaning on the ground. He ignored the fire in his side. In 2 long strides, he was on Tamsin, his body a shield. "Get down!" he roared. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight, and threw his weight, tackling her. They crashed to the salt, rolling over and over, until they slammed to a halt behind a wide, low boulder. its shadow a small patch of cool relief. They lay tangled, breathing hard, the smell of gunpowder and sweat and fear thick between them. "You can't hide! Pike!" Merritt screamed from the cliff. He stood up, trying to get a better angle, to aim into their small patch of cover. He levered another round into his rifle. Boom! The sound was not Merritt's rifle. It was the deep-throated roar of Alma's scattergun. She had moved, crawling along the ridge, closing the distance. The shot was long, desperate. "It didn't hit Merritt. It hit his rifle." A spray of buckshot slammed into the long barrel. Sparks flew. The wooden stock splintered into a dozen pieces. The gun torn from Merritt's grasp. He stared at his stinging, empty hands, then at Alma, who was calmly reloading. That was the end. The fight was gone. Cade Merritt turned and fled, scrambling up the switchback, disappearing over the rim. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the wind and the gasping breaths of the fighters. But it wasn't over. A low, scraping sound. Rowan pushed himself off Tamsin, his hand on his wounded side. Abram Kincaid was getting to his feet. His face was a mask of dirt and pure, unfiltered rage. His hat was gone. His pistol was gone. His knife was gone. But he was a snare man. He was a creature of backups. He lunged forward, pulling a second, smaller knife from his boot. He roared, a wordless sound, and threw himself at Rowan, who was still trying to stand. Rowan, slow from his wound, turned, pushing Tamsin behind him. He threw his arm up to block the strike. He was too late. The boot knife flashed. Rowan cried out. A sharp, choked sound. He felt a white-hot slicing pain in his left arm. The blade had cut deep into his bicep. Bright red blood welled up instantly, hot and shocking, spilling down his arm, dripping from his fingertips onto the white salt. "No?" Tamsin's voice was a scream. She pushed past Rowan, stepping in front of him. She was holding Josiah's pistol, and she held it with both hands. The barrel aimed squarely at Abram Kincaid's chest. Kincaid froze. He was 10 feet away, his knife still dripping. He looked at the heavy pistol. He looked at the small, soot-covered woman. He saw her bandaged wrist, the ripped clothing, the fury in her eyes. But he also saw her shaking. "It's over, Kincaid," Tamsin said. Her voice was low, trembling, but flat, final. Her eyes were not filled with hate. They were just done. They were the eyes of a person who would not be hunted another step. "The hunt is over. It's done." Kincaid looked from her face to the gun. He saw the tremble. He made his last, fatal miscalculation. He sneered, a low, ugly sound thick with contempt. He took a step. "You ain't got the—" Bang! The shot was dry, decisive. Tamsin didn't flinch. Her hands, at the last second, had lifted, just slightly. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for the symbol of his trade. The bullet struck the dented tin hat, which he had retrieved and put back on. The impact was dead center, in the old, crescent-shaped scar. The bullet didn't penetrate, but the kinetic force was tremendous. Kincaid's head snapped back as if he'd been hit by a sledgehammer. His eyes went wide with a final, profound surprise. He was thrown backward, his feet leaving the ground, and he collapsed onto the salt. Flat on his back. He did not move. A ringing silence fell over the Ghostwater Valley. The two remaining henchmen, Ellis and Josiah, stared at their fallen leader. They looked up at Alma on the ridge, who had her reloaded scattergun aimed at them. They looked at Tamsin, who stood, smoke rising from the barrel of her pistol. Slowly, as one. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The siege was broken. The battle was won. Later, Alma climbed down. She was all business. She found Cade Merritt cowering in a cleft of rock, whimpering. She tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and stuffed it in his mouth. She bound his hands tight with a leather string from her saddle. As she worked, tying the henchmen, the world itself seemed to shift. The oppressive, shimmering heat broke. A new wind, cool and smelling of damp stone, swept across the salt flats. It carried a new smell, not powder, not fear. It was the clean, sharp, unmistakable scent of the first rain, born in the distant mountains. It was the smell of a debt being paid. It was the sound of a bell ringing, signaling that the long, bloody ledger was finally, at last, closed. The high, thin wind that swept across the Ghostwater Valley was the only thing that moved. It pulled at the dust on Kincaid's still form and whispered around the two henchmen, Elias and Josiah, who stood with their hands high, their faces pale and defeated. Alma Reyes was a force of nature. She scrambled down the switchback, her scattergun never wavering. "You two," she barked at the henchmen. "On your bellies, hands behind your heads. Now." They fell, grateful to be out of her line of sight. Rowan Pike was on one knee, his head bowed, his left arm clamped tight against his bleeding bicep. The graze on his ribs was a sheet of fire. He was breathing in short, harsh gasps. Tamsin didn't look at the prisoners. She didn't look at Kincaid. She ran to Rowan. She fell to her knees in front of him, her hands hovering, afraid to touch the blood that was soaking his shirt. "Rowan, you're... It's just a cut," he gritted out, his voice tight with pain. "The other just a scrape. I'm all right." "You are not all right," she said, her voice sharp, not with panic, but with a sudden, fierce command. She ripped a long strip of cloth from the hem of her new woolen coat. "Show me, the arm." He let her take his arm. Her hands, which had been so cold in the cave, were now warm and surprisingly steady. She wrapped the cloth around his bicep, pulling it brutally tight, a makeshift tourniquet. He hissed. "Alma!" Tamsin yelled up, not taking her eyes off Rowan. "The letter, the one you said Amelia's letter." Alma, tying the henchmen's wrists with their own gun belts, nodded. "Kincaid, he'll have it. He took it from the widow's house. It was his proof, his leverage." Alma marched over to Kincaid's still body. She didn't hesitate, rolling him over, her hands searching his vest. Tucked in an inner pocket was a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. Alma pulled it out, her face grim. She looked at the blood on it, then tucked it safely into her own shirt. She retrieved Cade Merritt, who was still trying to hide in the rocks, and tied him to his own partners, a miserable, bound string of failed justice. "Rio Claro," Alma said, standing over Rowan and Tamsin. "The circuit judge is there. He's at the outpost. He'll hear this, he'll take the prisoners, and he'll take this letter." She patted her chest. The long walk back was a blur of salt and pain. They couldn't ride. Rowan was too weak, and the trail was too steep. Alma led the string of prisoners. Rowan walked, his face pale and set in lines of agony, his left arm bound tight, his right hand pressed to his ribs. Tamsin walked beside him. She had his horse's reins in one hand. With the other, she held his arm, steadying him, her shoulder braced against his, taking his weight. By the time they reached Alma's dugout, the world was turning gray. News, it turned out, traveled on the wind itself. A telegraph line ran through Rio Claro, and Alma's appearance with a gagged deputy, 2 known snaremen, and a dead bounty hunter was an event, but it was the letter that broke the dam. Amelia Hale's last words, read by a trembling circuit judge under a lantern, were more powerful than any bullet. It was a story of brutality, of a man broken by drink and pride, and of his final, awful act. And it was the story of his plan, to blame the natives, to frame the girl in the kitchen. By the next morning, the story was on the wire. By noon, it was in every saloon and general store in the territory. And Sutter Hale, in Farrier's Gap, heard it. He heard the truth was coming, carried by a lone rancher and a woman who wouldn't stay dead. He heard his wife's voice was reaching from the grave. Sutter Hale, his face as pale as the ghost water salt. Took his best horse and fled south. He didn't pack a bag, he just ran. His flight was a confession. Shouted to the entire territory. Tamsin's name was clear. They were back at Brimstone Draw 2 days later. The ranch was silent. The stable door was still scarred by smoke, but the building stood. Rowan, his arm in a clean white sling, his ribs wrapped tight, stood by the corral, looking at the mountains. He was pale, and he moved stiffly. The wound on his bicep had been deep. Tamsin came out of the small house. She was holding a tin bowl of hot water and a fresh roll of bandages. She had washed her face. Her hair, clean and black, was tied back with a leather string. The soot was gone. The wildness was gone. She was just her. She set the bowl down on the corral fence. "Sit," she said. He sat on the edge of the water trough. She unwrapped the crude bandage on his arm. The wound was raw, angry, but clean. She began to wash it, her touch gentle, but firm. Rowan watched her. He watched her steady hands, the concentration on her face. "You're good at that," he said, his voice quiet. "I've had practice on myself," she replied, not looking up. She applied the salve Alma had given them and began to rewrap his arm with the clean bandages. She pulled a knot tight. He winced. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Don't you be slow again," she whispered. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a memory of his brother. It was a command from her. "Don't you be slow. In this life. With me." He just nodded. "I hear you." She finished the knot and stepped back. They stood in the quiet yard. The air was heavy, thick and cool. The sky was a bruised purple-gray. The wind, the one that had been promising rain, was finally here. They walked, side by side, to the edge of the property. They stood at the lip of the Ghostwater Arroyo, the same place they had launched themselves into the dark, into the unknown. And then it came. A single drop of rain hit the dried dust at Tamsin's feet, then another and another. A thin, fragile sheet of water began to slide over the dry-baked mud. The smell of the air changed. It was the smell of damp earth, of sage, of life returning. A small, tentative flood was beginning. The long drought was breaking. Rowan reached into his shirt pocket. His fingers closed around the small, 2-inch square of faded blue cloth. He pulled it out. The little embroidered sparrow. The broken cage. He must have picked it up from the table before they fled the kitchen. He held it out to her. "I think this is yours," he said. Tamsin looked at the charm, then at his face. "No more cage, Tamsin," he said, his voice soft. "Just the sky." She took the charm from his hand. She held it, the thick, determined stitches pressing into her palm. A slow smile spread across her face. A real smile. One that reached her eyes, making them shine like the wet, clean stones in the arroyo. She looked up at him. "If there's a sky," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I want to fly with you." He hadn't expected that. He had expected her to leave, to run for the border, to find her freedom. She didn't want to run. She wanted to choose. He stepped closer, his wounded side, his bandaged arm. He was broken, and he was whole. She was scarred, and she was free. He put his good hand on her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. This kiss was not the first one, the one of shared breath and survival. It was not the second, the one of confession and comfort in the dark. This one was a promise. It was deep, and it was slow, and it was without fear. It was the kiss of a man who had found something he thought was lost, and a woman who had found something she never knew existed. His forehead rested against hers. Their shoulders touched. His hand was on her back, steadying her, and her hand came to rest on his chest, over his heart. They just stood there, breathing each other in, while the first clean rain of the season washed the salt and the blood from the land. The next day, they rode into Farrier's Gap. They rode side by side, Tamsin on the pail, beautiful ghost lantern. Rowan on his solid bay, sitting tall, despite the pain. The town went silent. Men on the boardwalk stopped, their hands frozen on their way to their hats. Women, baskets on their arms, stopped mid-stride. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. This was the woman who had been tied to the cottonwood tree. This was the rancher who had been declared an outlaw. They were not running. They were not in chains. They were here. As they rode down the center of the muddy street, a man, a shopkeeper who Tamsin recognized as one who had stared at her, who had done nothing, slowly, deliberately, took off his hat. A woman, Mrs. Albright, stood on the porch of the general store. She saw Tamsin, and she smiled. A small, public act of validation. One by one, men bowed their heads. They looked away. It wasn't a celebration. It was a quiet, heavy, communal apology. It was an acknowledgement that they had been slow. They had failed. Rowan and Tamsin stopped their horses in front of the marshal's office. They were here to give their testimony, to make the truth a legal fact. Rowan looked at her. At this woman, this survivor. He looked at her, sitting on his horse, the horse she had tried to steal from him, what felt like a lifetime ago. He remembered his first words to her, the anger, the suspicion, and he repurposed them. He took the old, ugly words and made them new. You don't need to steal horses anymore, Tamsin, he said, his voice low. Just for her. For the rest of this life, I'll carry you. Tamsin Redbird turned to him. The rain had made her face clean, and her eyes were bright and deep. She wasn't the girl in the stable. She was the woman who had faced down Kincaid. She was the woman who had chosen to fly with him. She smiled, a small, certain smile. Then carry me, she said, her voice soft and with no tremor at all. To a place called home. He nodded. Once, the promise was made. The action had begun. They sat their horses, not moving, just looking at each other. And above Brimstone Draw, the sky broke open, and the wind blew in, carrying the clean, free smell of the new, drenching rain. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below to say hello, share your thoughts, and connect with other listeners. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video. And if you enjoyed the story, please hit the hype button to help it reach more people.